And I think that's all of the bureaucratic stuff, so I think we can start. Chairman, do you mind reading some very big?
Sure. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity that we have to come and discuss your word and to learn from the story of Job. Father, we pray that you may teach us and lead us in teaching your truth, God, and that our hearts may be receptive to what your Spirit has to say to us this morning. In Jesus' name we pray.
So, last week, we were talking about Job's friends and about how that was not what I expected to happen. Hang on a second. It means that I probably have to go here. This isn't as embarrassing as how I messed up last week. Where I spent about 30 seconds sitting here doing this on the desk trying to figure out why the mouse pointer was moving. So, for someone who's a technical consultant for a living, I'm remarkably bad with technology. Last week we were talking about why Job's friends and Job, why everybody gets mad. Because ordinarily when someone has gone through a tragedy, you can pretty well count on that at least one or two clueless people will come say something that's horribly insensitive, and it would make things worse. But usually, the reaction that we have is that we figure, well, they mean well, and we cut them some slack. And even if we don't, even if we get angry, then the person who said the insensitive thing usually doesn't get angry back. They usually apologize. They say, oh, I didn't mean that, right? Not only does Job get angry, but his friends get mad at him for getting mad. And so we had some group discussions about why it worked out that way and what would cause a comforting session to reach the point where the people involved were so angry they couldn't even speak to each other, which is what happens. At the end of Job's conversation with his friends, they all just stop talking to each other because they're all too angry to speak. It goes as badly as it can possibly go. And we had a couple of things that came out of the discussion that we'll dig into today at more length. But that means there are a number of things that we will never get to in this class about Job. So I'm going to list them so that you can go home when you're done and you can think about it and play with them. One of them is Elihu. We have said pretty much nothing about Elihu except that he is angry too. Elihu is a very interesting character, and he's a somewhat difficult character to know what to make of. The narrator doesn't tell us what the narrator thinks of Elihu, and God doesn't have anything. So God praises Job, criticizes Job's three friends, and behaves as though Elihu didn't even exist. Right? So Elihu is a very interesting character to think about and talk about and try to figure out what's going on with him, and we don't have time to do anything with it. So that's something that you can play with on your own. A second thing that I thought we would get to, but we're not going to, is Job. You know, the picture that I have kind of painted of Job is that he is a good man, but he is very proud of what a good man that he is, and he's kind of obnoxiously proud about it. Because he doesn't realize that there's anything wrong with being proud of being good. And he is genuinely good. And he's genuinely proud of being good, and he likes the fact that everyone thinks he's a great guy. Right? And people don't necessarily generally tend to like that. He also probably, when other people were suffering, he probably assumed that they were sinners, just the same way that his friends assume that he's a sinner, right up until it happens to him. So everything that we've talked about the personality of Job, I don't know if you've noticed while we're doing it, but it's always been about what kind of person was Job before all this happened. Presumably, he comes out of it a different person in various ways. And we have spent no time talking about how Job treats people after he goes through all this. We haven't talked about, is there a difference between the way Job deals with people who are suffering before he has suffered and after he has suffered? So we haven't talked about that, and that's worth spending some time on. We haven't spent any time talking about how how the book of Job sheds any light on modern controversies about atheism, or Elie Wiesel's inability to forgive God for the Holocaust, or any of that, which may have been surprising because that's actually where usually people start with Job. The main reason that modern Americans read Job is because they've gotten into arguments with atheists, unless you go to read Job because tragedy has happened to you. Right? Those are the two reasons we usually go to Job. We haven't talked about it at all. It's worth talking about. I just felt like there were other things that were more important. We talked at the very beginning about how Job is handicapped in his making sense of the things that happened to him because he's not a Christian and has no chance of being a Christian, because he does not know about the resurrection. And in fact, Job plainly believes, as did pretty much all Israelites up until the Babylonian captivity, that once you die, that's pretty much it. Right? And the Christian answer to most of the problems of suffering is Paul saying, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. But Job has no idea about the glory that will be revealed in us. And that makes a huge difference to us intellectually. And we talked about that a little bit. What we haven't talked about is the difference. The fact that heaven is there and that God has all of eternity to redress injustices that happen in this life goes a long way to solving the intellectual problem of the suffering of the innocent. But it does nothing to solve the emotional problem. The other advantage that we have over Job is not just that we know the resurrection, but we know the passion. We know that Jesus, that God, when he became a man primarily for the purpose of suffering. And most of the intellectual force that comes from being angry with God for allowing people to suffer is from a sort of implicit assumption that he lets the suffering keep happening because it doesn't bother him. We have a natural assumption that says if God cared, he would stop it. In actual real life with human beings, one of the things we know from experience is that the best index for whether someone cares about your suffering or not is not whether or not they try to stop it, because people can stop other people's sufferings for all kinds of reasons other than caring about them. A politician can introduce programs to solve your suffering not because he cares about you, but because he thinks that's the best way to get power. The unjust judge in Jesus' parable of the unjust judge and the widow gives the widow her justice just to make her go away, right? But nobody doubts. So there are lots of people who have severe doubts that Teddy Kennedy cared about the poor at all. There is nobody who doubts that Mother Teresa cared about the poor. And the reason is that Mother Teresa shared the poverty of the poor. And there are lots of reasons that you can stop somebody's suffering. Maybe they're paying you to because you're a doctor, right? There are lots of reasons to stop somebody's suffering. There are very few reasons to share someone's suffering when you don't have to, other than that you love them, right? And so we could spend a long time talking about how the fact that God plays by his own rules and that God chose to suffer for us and with us changes the emotional calculus that Job wouldn't have had access to. Job and everybody else, they all sort of assume that Job's suffering is not causing God any distress. And that's sort of our natural assumption. And that deserves a full session, and we're not going to get to it. And we might get this today, but I kind of doubt it, because we're going to have more group discussion, and I like the group discussion to run. God says to Job's friends, "You have not spoken of me that which is right, as my servant Job has." And he repeats it twice. And so the question is, what is the thing that Job got right? Because clearly, when Job said, "God has wronged me," he doesn't have that part right. Clearly, not everything that Job says about God is correct. Job has gotten the situation wrong in some very significant ways. And yet, God says, "You have not spoken to me that which is right, as my servant Job has." And that's sort of the last question of the book. Maybe we get to it today. If we don't, that's something you can play with. All right? So, going back to the discussion that we started, where we ended last week, which is insensitive people saying stupid things and how that can hurt people. And there were a couple of answers. We had this group over here talking about trying to solve a problem. And we had the very good question that was raised, which was there actually anything that Job's friends possibly could have said that would have made him feel better? And then the other thing was people feeling like God's truth was threatened and they had to stand up for what is true, which I call torture by theology. So we're going to dig into those two in some depth and then do a rediscussion. And we'll just see how long that takes. All right? So I'm going to start with two mindsets. One is the solution mindset versus the blame mindset. Those of us who work in pretty much any profession, especially if you have worked in more than one company, understand that this difference is significant. I'm a consultant. So for a living, I move from one company to another. So I have done significant work at more than 100 different companies. And I can tell you that this is one of the maybe the single most basic way that I divide companies in my mind between healthy companies and unhealthy companies. It's the solution mindset versus the blame mindset. And the solution mindset is basically about how do we solve the problem, and the blame mindset is whose fault is this problem, right? So there are a number of differences that I want to make distinct. The solution mindset is it's all about how do we make the future better than the past has been. With the blame, it's all about whose fault is it that all these bad things happened to us. So one of them is a fundamentally forward-looking mindset, and the other one is looking back to what happened for the purpose of blame. Now the solution mindset will look back at what happened for the purpose of learning lessons about how to keep it from happening in the future, right? Solution mindset is focused on how do we achieve success, and the blame mindset is focused on whose fault is the past failure. People in solution mode are usually trying to stay calm and work the problem. People in blame mode, the dominant sort of emotional mode is anger. And on the characteristic conversation, this is sort of idiosyncratic terminology for me, just because I tried to find a way to think about language to solve a problem. And so I came up with sort of, these are my own definitions of discussions and debates and arguments. A discussion is where you're trying to figure out what's true or what's the best thing to do. The discussion is about, here's reality, here are my ideas, how do I get my ideas to line up with reality? And the fundamental thing that it's about, it's about the topic. An argument pretends to be about some subject. But what the argument is really about is each person is trying to prove that the other person is a jerk. In an argument, the real topic of discussion is which one of us is a bad person. Right? And the nominal topic of discussion is just sort of a pretext. What we're really about is which one of us has the right to be mad at the other person. Okay? Now obviously when you're in blame mode, that's pretty much the nominal topic. At whom should we be angry? All right, now, all of these things in ordinary workaday life, you get rewarded for spending time over here rather than over here, because problems get solved here and they don't get solved, they get exacerbated here. And for-profit businesses all exist in order to solve somebody's problem, all right? Walmart is there to help solve the problem of how I get clothes without spending too much money. Exxon is there to solve the problem of how I get to work without walking. Everybody in business is getting paid to solve some problem or other, and this works better than that. So you get rewarded for spending time over here. And there's a whole series of books on critical conversations. You know how you write one book, and that book is a big hit, so then you write the same book 5 more times with 5 other titles in order to generate more revenue, right? There's this guy who's written 5 books on critical conversations, and they're perfectly good books, even though they all say the same thing. But what he identified is that people get rewarded really, really well if not only do they live here, but if they're able to go into a room with a bunch of people in a high-stakes emotional thing and move everybody else in the room over to here. That if you have that skill, if you can get everybody in the room to calm down and stop worrying about blame and be in this mode, you can make a whole lot of money. So a lot of us naturally live here anyway, and then you go to work and you get rewarded for spending time over here. You get incentivized for spending time over here because it's much more effective solving problems. But there is one other critical difference. The fundamental focal point of the solution mindset is the problem. Fundamental focus of the blame mindset is the person. All right? This mindset is about the issue, and the characteristic statement about this is it's not personal. Right? There's nothing personal. Don't take this personally. Right? This is all about relations. Now, for most of what follows, we're going to be talking about how to deal effectively when we find ourselves needing to talk to someone who's gone through tragedy. And one thing to keep in mind is that everybody is different and everybody's unique. So we can give you general statements, and those general statements will apply to most people. There are always going to be exceptions. I'll use myself as an example. If I am sick, what I mostly want is to be left alone. And if you're coming in every 5 minutes to offer me soup, or to ask if I want some hot chocolate, or you will irritate me to no end. All right? I don't want to be visited when I am sick. I want to be able to crawl into my den and be left alone and get better. Now, there are other people, I might hypothetically be married to one, who do not have that reaction, right, when they are sick. And if they're sick and you leave them alone, then they feel neglected and unloved. Right? Now, if a friend of yours gets sick, you have to decide whether to go visit them or not. And if they're like me and you visit them, you will kind of irritate them. And if they're like Helen and you visit them, they will be very grateful. Okay? And you have to pick one. And we have to do stuff like this all the time. We have to just kind of make our guess about what will make the other person feel better. And what you do, now in the case of being sick, if you come visit me, I will be aware of the fact that you have been told all your life that you should visit sick people. And I will assume that you mean me nothing but good, and I will cut you some slack, and I'll be irritated, but I'll be polite, and I won't be angry with you because I will know that you are trying to be nice to me. right? So the thing to do when someone gets sick is you go visit them, because number one, most people appreciate it, and number two, the people who don't like it will know that you are trying to be nice, right? And then you pay attention while you're there, so that if it becomes obvious that you're annoying them, you can say, oh, I need to not visit this guy who likes to be left right, and that's how you deal with people. So we're going to talk about some generalizations here, and those generalizations hold pretty well. I'm just telling you, you have to be prepared for the fact that there will be exceptions. So just pay attention, right? Just pay attention to their body language and the way they're acting. And one of the generalizations that comes through this is that not blame and solution, but this focus on the problem and focus on the person. If you've been through very much marital counseling, or you've read, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus kinds of books, you will have seen this sort of focus on the problem is described as the way men think. And you will have seen the relational focus as being the way women think. All right? There is a high correlation. But a lot of the advice that's given in marriage, that's set in terms of husbands versus wives, what's really going on is the difference between a problem mindset and a person mindset, which typically in a marriage relationship, especially with young couples, if one of them is in this mode and one of them is in that mode, this is usually the husband, that's usually the wife. But what's driving it is not male versus female. What's driving it is this mindset. It's perfectly possible for the roles to reverse, and if they do, the dynamic will reverse. All right? Now, if we go to comfort, if we have someone who needs to be comforted, that brings in a third mindset. The focal point for solution is the problem. The focal point for blame is the person. The person who needs comfort is expecting you to be focused on them as a person. Right? The time orientation of the future, that's good. The future solution, the solution is how do we make the future better? The blame mindset is in the past. For comfort, it's about being with the person in their existing pain right now. The sort of focal point in the solution mindset is very analytical. How do I get the problem solved? The blame mindset is who was responsible for the failure? In the comfort mindset, it's a success orientation, but it is relational success. And what it comes down to, we have different ways to say it. We'll say, make sure they feel like they're not having to go through this alone, right? Or we have different ways to say it and express it, but what it comes down to is, fundamentally, you're there to make them feel loved. And we'll talk about that more, but that's fundamentally what you're there for. And whereas in the solution mindset, you're trying to be non-emotional so you can figure out how to solve the problem. Being non-emotional in a comfort mindset is disastrous. You are there to feel compassion, right? And while the characteristic conversation for solving a problem is discussions, with comfort, it is whatever expresses love, which for a whole bunch of people isn't even talking at all. And I do not mean to turn this into a class on love languages. If you're not familiar with 5 love languages, that's a good concept. Buy the book, read it, it's worth doing. But and again I'll use myself as an example because in some ways I'm a weird person. And one of them is in love languages. If you test me for, the 5 love languages, which is gifts and words of affirmation and acts of service and quality time and physical touch, I don't move the needle at all on gifts. And I am aware that gifts make people feel loved, but I am aware of that at a purely intellectual level, sort of the way that a sociopath is aware that knowing that you've done something bad makes some people feel guilty. Right? I know that it happens. It doesn't do anything for me. Words of affirmation. Basically, nothing moves the needle for me until you get to physical touch, at which point, bam, I'm pegged. I'm off the scale for physical touch. About the only way that you can make me feel loved is physical touch. I will intellectually recognize that you love me if you give me words of praise, and I'll give you credit for it, right? But if I am ever, in the case of tragedy, by far the best thing you'll be able to do for me is just come sit next to me and put your arm around me, right? Talking doesn't do any good at all. So different people express love in different ways, people feel love in different ways. So what the discussion looks like really comes down to how do you communicate love to this person. Now, I'm going to use a kind of humorous example from marriage to talk about what happens if you come to someone who needs comfort and you give them a solution. Years ago, somewhere between 15, 20 years ago, I was on a father and child camp out with a homeschooling co-op. So it was a bunch of dads and the kids, but a significant numbers of the fathers who were there had only been married for a year or two, and they were actually there with their stepchildren. They were trying to form a bond with the stepchildren of their new wives, with the children of their new wives. And they didn't have much experience being married. So all the kids went to bed, the dads were up sitting around the campfire. I don't remember how the topic came up, but one of these new husbands says, "You know what drives me crazy about my wife?" He says, I will come home, and she'll come home from work, and she'll start talking to me about some problem that she's had at work. And before he got any further, there were at least 2 or 3 of the older experienced husbands who said, "Oh wait, please don't tell us you tell her how to solve the problem." And he looked at us like we were insane. I mean, he just had this look like we had hit him on the head with a 2 before. He's like, "What? Well, yeah, right?" Because he couldn't imagine why you would tell someone about a problem other than because you wanted to know how to fix it, right? And so we're like, no. You don't say, "This is how you solve it." You say, "I'm so sorry you're having to go through that. That must have been awful," right? She just wants to know you're there and on her side. If you tell her how to solve the problem, she'll think it's your fault. She'll think you're saying it's her fault. And he says, "Yeah, that's what she says." "No. Yes." Well, then he's like, "Well, why did she tell me?" He said, No, you don't understand, right? He couldn't imagine any mindset other than this one. And that actually happens a ton in marriages. You have that argument, and the young wife, who doesn't know men very well, goes storming off to her room, cannot imagine, why would he blame me? And the guy's sitting there in the kitchen saying, "What just happened to me?" Right? Well, what's happening is the person who expects comfort expects you to be in a relational mode. And if you do anything that doesn't fit here, they don't perceive you as being here. They perceive you as being here. Does that make sense? Right? And again, it doesn't matter what you mean. How people feel is determined by how they perceive the situation, right? The guy on the train tipping you and all that. So, people in pain, they desire comfort and they assume that you are not treating them impersonally and analytically. And in fact, if you are, that's kind of offensive. Right? Now, think about this. If I'm having a problem with somebody at work and I'm looking for a solution, and I realize that something I'm doing is annoying the other person, okay? That is great news, because that means I can fix my problem, right? That means I've got control of the situation. If I change what I do, I can solve my problem, right? So if you come to me and you say, "I've got great news for you, you can fix your problem if you change how you're treating this person," that's awesome. If I am in blame mode and I'm looking for who to blame for the problems, and I realize that what I'm doing is causing the problem, that is bad news, because it means it's my fault. Right? So, this dynamic, right? The young wife tells her husband about this problem she's having at work with an unreasonable superior, and her husband says, "Oh, I've got great news. It's the way you're behaving." Right? He's not going to get the gratitude and the hosannas that he's expecting. Right? Because he expects that to be good news. He's solving her problem. What she hears is bad news. He's blaming her. All right? Now, that doesn't, I use the husband and the wife because it's entertaining. But it's not a husband and wife issue. It is a solution versus comfort issue. If you come to somebody who's in relational mode and you start explaining how they need to act differently to solve their problems, their natural reaction is not going to be one of gratitude, right? Because people in pain generally perceive analysis as apathy, and they generally perceive advice as blame. Not how you intend it, of course. But that's how it tends to, and look, there are going to be people who are exceptions. There are going to be people who are hyper-analytical even inside their own tragedy. Okay? But generally speaking, this is how people behave. Now, if we, this is the best way I know of to think of it. Problems can be solved. Wounds have to heal. Okay? If you're dealing with someone who has been through tragedy, you are not dealing with somebody who has a problem. I know that sounds weird to say that they don't have a problem, but you're not dealing with somebody who fundamentally has a problem. You're dealing with somebody who fundamentally has a wound. They have been hurt. And wounds can't get solved. Suffering isn't something that gets solved. Something is something that gets endured and it gets lived through. Because it just takes time, right? And if you look at the New Testament, when the New Testament talks about suffering, the New Testament doesn't spend a lot of time telling us how to get our suffering to stop. The New Testament spends a lot of time talking about the rewards for the people who endure the suffering and live through the suffering without losing faith. Blessed is the man who endures trial. The only time Job is mentioned in the New Testament, what is praised is his perseverance. What is praised is that he did not curse God and die. He stuck in with it long enough to get through the suffering and get rewarded. And the thing that helps people endure the most is feeling loved. And not feeling like they're having to do it on their own. And that is why I say that in the comfort mindset, the primary thing that you're there to do is to make the person feel loved. You cannot make the pain go away. There is no magic phrase that you can say that will solve their problem. It is going to take time to heal. If you do go in trying to solve the problem, you won't solve the problem, and the best that you can hope for is that you won't do any harm. Right? Turn the lights off.
Let me take a second just to breathe. Found a place just for me, where the silence washes over, where I see the horizon, close my eyes, it's like I'm flying. That's where it all makes sense to me.
Job. So, getting back to Job. The New Testament praises Job for his perseverance. Job cannot make his problems stop. The only thing he can do is endure. But that's not Job's goal. Job's endurance kind of happens by accident, right? Job is not a good Christian who has this stuff happen and says, I know that my present suffering is not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed in me. I will endure to the end so that I may be saved. All right? Job wants to make his suffering go away, and he has a strategy. His strategy is he's going to make God come give him a fair hearing. Because if he can just get a hearing with God and straighten out the misunderstanding, then his suffering will stop. This is not an effective strategy because his basic assumptions are wrong. But he thinks it's going to be. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to make his problem go away. His friends completely agree that the thing that needs to be done is we need to find a way to end Job's suffering. They think he has the wrong strategy. They think the strategy he should be following is he should be repenting of whatever terrible, horrible sin it is that's hidden. And they both feel like, they both start with this idea that God is angry with Job, and that the problem that needs to be solved is they need to find a way to get God to stop being angry with Job. In point of fact, that's not what's going on at all, and there's nothing Job can do to make his suffering go away sooner. The only thing he could do is mess up and make it last longer by doing the wrong things. But he cannot solve the problem. But both he and they, their entire conversation is 100% about what Job has to do to make the suffering go away. So from the beginning to the end of their conversation is dead on arrival as far as its chances of success. Does that make sense? So, number one, they're wasting time trying to solve a problem that can't be solved. Number two, it is clear in their place, it's not, they are presenting the problem as, we care about you, we want to solve your problem, so you need to repent of the terrible sin that you have done. It's not even a matter of implicitly blaming the victim, they are explicitly blaming Job for everything that's happened. Right? If you read Job's conversation with his friends, with the awareness that all four of them are trying to solve a problem that doesn't even exist. And that all of in other words, the problem that Job is suffering, that exists, but they're trying to solve the problem that God is upset with Job and is punishing him. And that problem does not exist. But it's the only thing really that they want to talk about, is how to go about solving the problem of getting God to not be mad at Job anymore. Right? But the dynamic that kicks in is they wind up blaming Job. Job feels blamed. He feels like, number one, he's being falsely accused, and that really drives Job crazy. And number two, it's by his friends who ought to be providing comfort. Right? So that's the solution mindset. How much of the dynamic is being driven by this is sort of a matter of how you choose to read it. Right? It's kind of how you see the people involved. And the reason is that the second thing that this group here brought up is also very clearly in play. And that is what we call torture by theology. Now, Jesus says in John, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And we believe very strongly, we are conditioned by our Christianity to believe very strongly that the truth has to be part of the answer, right? That the truth is a good thing. And Proverbs 16, sorry, bad reference. Proverbs 27:16, faithful are the wounds of a friend. So we're used to the concept of things like intervention, right? Tough love. When you care about somebody and you tell them the stuff that they don't want to hear, but they need to hear it. Right? But Ecclesiastes 3:1-8, there's a time for everything under the sun, right? Job's friends very clearly consider themselves to be telling Job what he needs to hear because they care about him. Right? They are giving him tough love. I want to change the example I gave last week a little bit. So last week I gave an example of assume that my son Rusty has his new driver's license, he's driving, he's texting while he's driving, he runs a red light, he gets killed. And people are trying to my tragedy. Let's assume that his younger sister Sally was in the car with him and was killed, and that she's like 12. And the reason I want to assume that is that we're going to pretend that Sally had not been baptized yet. I don't know if you're aware of it. This church is an extremely Anabaptist church. We are very concerned to make sure nobody gets baptized without knowing what they're doing and really being committed. And so one of the things that Helen and I discovered a couple of years ago is we talked to the church about having Kai baptized, and this church isn't really willing to baptize Kai until he's 13 or 14. Now, the reason that I bring that up, so we'll assume, so Kai hasn't been baptized, we'll pretend Sally hasn't. I grew up in Southeast Oklahoma, as I might have mentioned, and the disciples of Christ would not go to church with the Baptists. And the difference of opinion was on whether you were saved as soon as you accepted Jesus or whether you were saved after you were baptized. And I remember hearing a sermon. Now look, certainly not all disciples of Christ were as extreme as the guy I'm going to describe. You know, you've got my father's a Disciples of Christ minister, and he's not like this. But I remember hearing, I can't remember who it was, but I remember a preacher, I thought about acting it out, but I don't think the music stand's strong enough to deal with being pounded on the board. But preaching on Peter's sermon in Acts. And it was basically a sermon. The whole point of the sermon was to prove that the Baptists were wrong and didn't believe the scripture. And so he's saying, the crowd asks, what must we do to be saved? What must we do? Must means you have to do it. It means that you are not saved until it is done. And what does Peter answer? He answers, repent and be baptized. And A-N-D. It means not this one, not that one. It means both of them, right? I'm not exaggerating either. I can do a good Baptist preacher imitation when I need to, and you don't even have to parody it. They're self-parodying. Now, and I have to tell this joke. Fellow dies, St. Peter meets him, and he says, great to see you. There's been a slight mix-up. You came to the wrong gate. Your mansion's all the way to the other side of heaven, but that's all right. We got time. So they start walking through. Well, heaven turns out to be like a luxury hotel. There's these great big pillars and the ballrooms, and he's just going down. He sees a room over here, and it says Methodists. And there's a big party going on in there, and he goes a little further, and there's another one, and it says Roman Catholics, and man, they're running a lottery, and they're having a ball, and it goes a little bit further. Here's the Lutherans, and eventually he turns a corner and starts going down this long hall with no rooms. So they go for a long way, and then they turn another corner, and they turn another corner, and St. Peter starts tiptoeing. And the newbie says, Pete, what's going on? Peter says, shh, 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 shh. We're getting close to the disciples of Christ, and they think they're the only ones here. That was a joke that we enjoyed telling when I was in the Disciples of Christ. I can very well imagine, and the situation I described, having one of my friends from the Disciples of Christ use Sally's death to harangue me about how I had to go ahead and get Kai baptized because I didn't want a second child to go to hell. I can absolutely imagine being told out of love by one of these people that Sally was in hell because I had neglected to get her baptized, and that I needed to get Kai baptized because there was no guarantee that he would make it to 13 years old. And they would feel obliged to do that because they would be trying to keep Kai from going to hell. There is a passage in Life on the Mississippi. We'll see if I still have battery power. Mark Twain is talking about having gone back to his hometown of Hannibal, Missouri. And he sees the house, he recognizes the house as being the house of a boyhood friend of his named Lem Hackett. He says, when I was a small boy, Lem Hackett was drowned on a Sunday. He fell out of an empty flatboat where he was playing. Being loaded with sin, he went to the bottom like an anvil. He was the only boy in the village who slept that night. We others all lay awake repenting. We had not needed the information delivered from the pulpit that evening that Lem's was a case of special judgment. We knew that already. Now, I don't know if you caught the implication here. For one thing, when I was a kid, we still did this. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. Everybody was in church those 3 times. So you had a service Sunday morning, you had a service Sunday night. I don't know if you noticed what happened in that passage. This boy was playing on a Sunday afternoon and drowned. In the service that night, within hours of his having died, the preacher said from the pulpit that he had drowned as punishment for his sins, and told all the other boys that they needed to repent and be good, lest God drown them too. And that used to be common. Now, if you asked that pastor, he would say he was trying to keep the other little boys from going to hell. But you can imagine the effect that that sermon would have had on anybody who loved Lem Hackett. It appears to have really grieved my computer as well. The computer ceased functions. Now, what that tells us is that people who very firmly hold some theological belief and think eternal souls and damnation are at stake can say some really horrific things because they feel like whatever earthly pain is caused is less than the pain of being in hell for all eternity. Right? You can see how someone would logically get to that conclusion. So you can see Job's friends feeling like he's got to be led to repentance no matter how much pain it causes him. But what would make somebody not just say that, but then get angry when the person they're helping does not respond well? Right? Because Job's friends give him the tough love, but then when he doesn't like it, rather than saying, well, I can understand why he wouldn't like it, they get furious, they get offended, they get angry. Right? We have this concept of righteous anger. If you hear someone described as having righteous anger, what is it that you think the phrase adding righteous to anger means? What does that mean? What's the difference between someone who's mad and someone who is experiencing righteous anger?
Trying to justify it.
They're trying to justify it? Yes, absolutely. And how?
Or it's justifiable anger, I guess, because it's, they're,
I think usually we mean something a little bit more. We mean it's justifiable, but I think usually we mean something a little bit more. Because think of it this way. If my friend told me, you better get Kai baptized so he doesn't go to hell too, I think most people would feel that if I got angry, it was justifiable anger, but I don't think most of us would describe me as having righteous anger. Right?
Anger on God's behalf.
They're angry because they feel that it's their responsibility to be angry.
Yeah, so they feel like they have a moral obligation and they're angry on God's behalf, right? I think the biggest thing is that righteous anger, you at least perceive it to be on somebody else's behalf. On God's, or on behalf of the oppressed, right? And we do feel like you are morally obliged to be angry at what the Nazis did to the Jews, right? You feel morally obliged to be angry at what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians if you're a Democrat, or with what the Palestinians are doing to the Israelis if you're a Republican, right? That you feel morally obliged to be angry on somebody's behalf. The difference between being angered by injustice and being angered by blasphemy, like the Muslims being angry over the cartoons or whatever, right, is the difference between being angry on behalf of human beings who are suffering and, as Jocelyn said, being angry on God's behalf. And I knew it. I dropped it and messed it up. Now, do we actually need to be angry on God's behalf? Does God need us to protect him? I don't think so, and nobody disagreed. I was prepared to go with it if someone disagreed, but nobody seems to. So let's just proceed in the interest of time with the assumption that God doesn't need us to be angry. All right? When you get angry because somebody is committing heresy, right? If God doesn't need you to be angry because people are saying false things about God, then the only person for you to be angry for is either some other person that you think is being harmed by the heresy, but usually it's somebody else that we're angry on their behalf. Usually we are angry, whether we realize it or not, on our own behalf. We are angry because the other person isn't giving us enough credit for our good intentions, or we're angry. In other words, if somebody believes something that's false and is liable to send them to hell, and we care about them, we may be distressed on their behalf. We may feel sorry for them. We may be worried about them. Not usually angry at them. So I'm going to walk through one sort of dynamic of how we can get angry when our theological beliefs are challenged. And if we're not aware that this dynamic happens, we can, because it happens automatically. It's not a matter of choosing to get angry. When we had the Reformation, there was a reaction against the idea that you went to heaven by doing enough of the right religious things. You bought your indulgences, you endowed a convent so that they could pray for your souls, get through, Pascal makes fun of the Jesuits by saying that at Notre Dame they had 4 masses going on at once on the 4 different sides of the altar, and they staggered them. So if a mass took 60 minutes, they started at 15-minute intervals, so that you could come and listen to 4 parts of the service at once, and you could get your mass done in 15 minutes and be done, right? Because you just had to get the bread and wine, because that's what mattered. So there's this huge reaction against salvation by works which is salvation by doing the right religious things. And obviously the correct thing is salvation through faith, by faith, through grace. But now faith is fundamentally about relationships. What is tempting is to mistake the concept of faith as a relationship for faith as a matter of believing the right things. And we tend to overreact to whatever heresy, that we're reacting against. We tend to overreact. So, one of the things that is very common in evangelical churches is that without really realizing it, we get salvation by believing the right religious things, as opposed to salvation by doing the right religious things. And again, I grew up with Southern Baptist Disciples of Christ, so this is a dynamic that I've seen over and over because it was especially common where I grew up. If you challenge the interpretation of Scripture for somebody who feels good about going to heaven because he feels like he believes the right things, it's very easy for that to feel like it's an existential threat. And what you see fairly commonly with people who come out of the background that I came out of is that if you challenge their interpretation of Scripture, then they don't react with intellectual curiosity. You don't find yourself in a discussion. You remember me talking about how anger can be purely a chemical thing, right? That you perceive a threat and you go into survival mode, right? Well, if every time somebody challenges the things that you believe to be religiously true, you feel threatened and go into survival mode, one of the most common modes is anger. And I think probably most of us know some people, I coming from where I came from know a lot of people, that the reaction anytime you challenge some dearly held belief of theirs about Scripture, if you say to a Pentecostal that God doesn't want everybody to speak in tongues necessarily, or if you say to a Southern Baptist that it is possible for someone to be a Christian and then lose their salvation, right, that their reaction is one of hostility and anger. Now, if you are comforting a friend and you give them this truth that you think is the key to their situation, and their response is to challenge your belief, it is very easy to go into anger mode. Now, the problem for a lot of us is we don't necessarily know what those beliefs are. So the practical advice here is simply, if you're in a situation like this, and you find yourself getting angry, then stop. All right? Go away. Just stop. Your anger will do no good. Go away, figure out what's going on inside of yourself, because you can do no good when you're angry. Job's friends I'll just give you my answer. Job's friends had this nice, clean, comfortable belief that as long as you're a good religious person and you keep all the rules, the kinds of things that happen to Job will not happen to you. Right? They've got God taped out. Number one, they are wise people. They know all about God. They tell everyone else about God. That's their role in the community. If it turns out that they're really wrong about God, that's really bad for their self-image and for who they see themselves. So maybe that's part of it. But also, if it turns out that you can do everything right and still have the things that happened to Job happen to you, that means it could happen to them. Right? But they've got this nice, neat little theology that really works for them. And they come to Job and they say, you just need to repent because then God will start blessing you. And Job says, not true. Right? Job doesn't just say, I'm innocent. Job has an entire chapter where he points out that there are evil people who live in luxury their entire lives doing evil, and they die peacefully in their sleep. In point of fact, Job does an outstandingly effective job of attacking their theology. And their response is fury. Right? Now, what they ought to do is they ought to get up and leave. Instead, what they do is they sit there and argue with Job and attack him, and they go into anger mode, and they stay there. There will be times when you feel like you have to tell somebody a painful truth. If you tell them the pain, not just the bereavement, right? But if you tell them the painful truth and their response starts making you angry, you need to disengage because you're not doing any good, right? Now, we have about 10 minutes left. God gets upset with Job's friends because they say things about him that are not true. What they get in trouble for is they get in trouble because their theology is bad, right? God doesn't say, my wrath is kindled against you because you dealt insensitively with my servant Job. It says, my wrath is kindled against you because you have not spoken of me what is right. And they thought they were defending him. They thought this whole time that they were defending God against all the terrible things that Job was saying about him. Some of the things we believe about God we probably have wrong. This is a somewhat alarming thing to any of us who have a tendency to tell people the difficult truths about God that they don't want to hear, because if it turns out that the difficult truths about God aren't actually true about God, the example of Job's friends would seem to be that we can get in trouble with God for doing that. On the other hand, when God is talking to Ezekiel, he says, if the watchman sees the sword coming and doesn't blow the trumpet so that my people are not warned and the sword comes and takes any one of them, that man is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hands. So Ezekiel, and God then says to Ezekiel, I have made you my watchman. So with Ezekiel, it would appear that you can get in trouble if you're supposed to say the truth that the person doesn't want to hear and you don't say it, right? So there appear to be two different ways to get in trouble with God. One of them is to refuse to say a difficult truth to the person who needs to hear the difficult truth. The other is to go say a difficult truth to your friend and turn out to be wrong. So the last we got 5 minutes. So the last 5 minutes of this whole class, this is the way the class is going to end. How do you thread that line? How do we know when to do the tough love and when to back off and not wound?
I think that a lot of it has to do with the way that you approach the person, obviously, And I think that if you come from a situation where you feel like you've got the corner on God, and it comes through that my way is the only way of thinking about God, and there's no variation, it's going to come across a lot differently. then with maybe perhaps a little tincture of humbleness that, that perhaps, our limited understanding and so forth, and I can tell you that I spent a lot of time reading about theology and just all that stuff, but the more and more I read, the more and more muddier the water is. The more and more that I realize that, what, because it was like in my younger days, as a new Christian and so forth, man, that theology was airtight, right? There wasn't a single discrepancy, and you had it all figured out, and, and all that. There was no, question, here and there, right? But now, it's really a lot different. And, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about things. And, and so I just feel like if we all meet God face to face right now, okay, our understanding is going to be blown out of the water. Even if we were to meet Jesus, let's say, if we were to be transported 2,000 years ago, our understanding of who Jesus is going to be very, very different. I think his Jewishness and just his whole understanding would just blow people out of it. They're not anything like us. He's not anything like us, And so I just think that, I think that when we approach, I think these kinds of issues, I think that you have to come through with a little bit of humbleness. And then you have to come across and asking questions, like a psychiatrist in a certain sense, and probing. And asking people, and hopefully, if you've got, more experience with this, that they can come to a sense of self-discovery, rather than you kind of, banging across, the truth, because, what, this is my understanding of it. So I think that might be one way to think. Because you're still broaching the subject, but it's something that you're getting them to talk and figuring out, some of the difficulties, in the topic.
I'd agree with all of that, except I would upgrade a little bit to a lot of.
Sure.
But, yeah. Helen, you were going to say something? Okay, thought you were waving at me. She was probably waving at me saying, it's almost time to quit. What else?
I guess I'm probably the young guy in your example. I guess I'm just trying to, I feel like when Paul in Romans 14 is talking about young, stronger, and weaker brothers, and each one should be convinced in his own mind of what he believes, I feel like I do need to try to study theology and try to understand some picture, rather than just saying there's no answer and there's a lot of unknowns, but I do take what you say, I want to take it to heart, because I feel like I can become like what you're saying, not humble. But how do you kind of balance that? I guess we're going off the topic, but part of it is they were wrong, and Ezekiel knew what God wanted him to say. It's part of it, right?
The trouble is, you always think you're right.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Now, I do have a question. You remember last night I asked you one question, but you didn't have time to reply to me, answer me. So I think that's the real question after all the discussion. The cancer patient that I was serving, so his wife told me yesterday, so the husband is a cancer patient here, and the wife told me last week, on January 13th, the wife's grandpa died in China, but they are here in Houston. And then the husband, the patient's father, died on January 16th. So that's 13th and 16th. And then on 19th, the husband's uncle died on 19th. So like in 1 week, 3 relatives passed away. And then the patient's mother is disabled at home in China. So how can I comfort them? What can I say?
Yeah. I don't think there's much.
I have been trying to tell them, about God and Jesus, and in this situation, how can I tell them that God loves me, right? Is in control.
I think it's the wrong time to tell people that God loves them at that time.
You
I
know?
mean, I can just tell you that, I mean, even if, these are non-Christians, I presume? They are Christians?
No.
But they're not Christians? I mean, there's a time for that. I think there's a time for that. And I think that when people are in that degree of suffering and stuff like that, I'll tell you what God's attribute that comes out the fullest, even if you are a Christian, is that He is sovereign. And ultimately, that's what Job ultimately comes up with. You know, he's not like, oh God, I love you for doing this to me. Oh, I love you for, for doing all, you're showering me with every single blessing. You know, that's not what he concludes. He's concluding that God is sovereign. He's going to do what He does. And my job is to endure it. So I think that if you're going to go and talk about God's love, there's certain times for that. But I'm not so sure after 3 close people have died to them that that's what you want to say to them.
It's just be with them, cry together
Exactly.
with them.
I mean, you can serve them, bring them food, be there. If they want to talk to you, you're there. But I think that if we start talking too much, because we think, we're helping, it may not be the best thing to do.
I think because I know a little bit more and Robin's not about to mention it. I think part of the answer is looking at your own experience in dealing with these cancer patients. So there are probably 15 or 16 different cancer patients that Helen has led to Jesus. The common element is that Helen is very good at that comfort thing where we're talking about making people feel loved and talking about how much of it didn't have anything to do with talking, right? With the access, all the ways to communicate love, and a lot of them aren't even verbal. The reactions that you commonly get from cancer patients who have become Christians is that they were blown away by how much more Helen and Ju appear to love them than their own family members do. And they talk about how difficult it was. Go ahead, come on through.
Sorry.
No, we should be done. They talk about how astonished they were by how much Helen and Ju loved them. And that is what makes it possible for them to believe that God loves them too. It's not apologetics, it's nothing theological. It's that they see God's love in Helen and Ju. That's what makes it possible. And it's the effective comfort that generates the effective evangelism. It's not effective evangelism bringing comfort. Does that make sense? I think that's a good place to end the class. Thank you guys very, very much for being here. And do fill out those, any suggestions that you have, that would be great. So next week, room 113. Never mind, room 113. Just to remember that. And thank you guys again. There we go. Yeah, and if you text me your email address, then I can send you the presentation. If you want. And it doesn't hurt my feelings in the slightest when nobody asks for the presentation. I'm practically impossible to refuse.
What class is going to be in the room when
So the next 4 weeks, there are 4 different classes on missions, and they're cycling through the 4 different rooms. So there's 4 different rooms. You just go to the same room every week, and that way you get 4 classes. So I don't know which one's starting. I don't know which one is starting. There's one on English evangelism in China, I think. There's like 4 topics. So just go to the same place every week, and you'll get the 4 classes.
one. Now I take a break.
Thank you, Kenny.
Oh,